In the shadowed expanse where the horizon dissolves into an unending gray, a figure moves without destination, its form bent under the invisible yoke of being. Existence presses upon it, like the slow grind of tectonic plates, shifting imperceptibly yet inexorably, carving canyons of doubt into the soul. There is no origin to this wanderer, no birthplace marked by joy or tragedy, only the perpetual awareness that emerges from the void, unbidden and unrelenting. The air hangs heavy, saturated with the residue of forgotten breaths, each inhalation a reminder of the futility woven into the fabric of reality. Why persist when every step echoes the hollow rhythm of an indifferent cosmos? The ground beneath yields slightly, a soft betrayal, as if the earth itself conspires to swallow the evidence of passage, erasing trails before they can form meaning. Consider the weight of consciousness, that cruel gift which illuminates the absurdity of striving. It begins subtly, a whisper in the recesses of thought, the recognition that desires are mere illusions, fleeting sparks in an eternal night. The wanderer pauses, gazing at the featureless sky, where clouds drift without purpose, mimicking the aimless drift of human aspirations. What is ambition but a fragile construct, erected against the encroaching dark, only to crumble under its own instability? The mind spirals inward, tracing the contours of isolation, where solitude is not chosen, but imposed by the very nature of individuality. Each being, trapped in its solitary vessel, reaches out in vain, fingers brushing against the impenetrable barriers of otherness. The horror lies not in the absence of connection, but in the perpetual tease of its possibility, a mirage that evaporates upon approach, leaving the throat parched with unspoken longings. Deeper still, the pressure builds, psychological fissures widening into chasms. The wanderer contemplates the illusion of control, how the self deludes itself with narratives of agency, scripting roles in a play without audience or author. Actions unfold, consequences ripple, yet all lead to the same inexorable dissolution. Memory serves as tormentor, replaying fragments of perceived triumphs and failures, each loop tightening the noose of regret. What purpose in recollection, when time devours all equally, reducing empires to dust and whispers to silence? The existential dread coils tighter, manifesting as a visceral ache, the body rebelling against the mind's revelations. Limbs grow heavy, as if laden with the accumulated debris of unrealized potentials, the wanderer sinking to knees in the yielding soil, breath labored under the burden of knowing too much, or perhaps too little. The atmosphere thickens, oppressive in its stillness, a sermon delivered by the void itself. Behold the cycle of emergence and erasure, where life asserts itself only to be negated, a rhythmic pulsation devoid of progression. Ideas evolve, not linearly, but in widening gyres, encompassing broader vistas of despair. From the personal torment of unfulfilled yearning, the gaze expands to the collective delusion of societies, constructs built on shifting sands of shared fictions. Nations rise, ideologies clash, yet beneath the clamor lies the same foundational emptiness, the realization that all structures are ephemeral defenses against the abyss. The wanderer envisions multitudes, each ensnared in their private hells, laboring under illusions of significance, their efforts dissolving into the ether like mist under a merciless sun. The dread intensifies, a slow suffocation, as the interconnectedness of suffering reveals itself. One being's anguish echoes in another's, amplifying the universal groan of existence. Psychological layers peel away, exposing the raw nerve of identity. Who is this wanderer, if not a temporary assemblage of atoms, animated by fleeting electrical impulses? The self fragments under scrutiny, dissolving into constituent parts, thoughts without thinker, emotions without essence. The horror resides in this disintegration, the gradual erosion of coherence, leaving only a spectral observer adrift in chaos. Philosophical undercurrents surge, questioning the essence of reality. Is the external world a projection of inner turmoil, or does the turmoil arise from the world's inherent hostility? The spiral descends further, encompassing the terror of infinity, the mind recoiling from the prospect of endless reiteration, rebirths into fresh agonies without respite or revelation. Eternity mocks the finite, stretching moments into eons of unrelieved tension, each second a droplet in an ocean of torment. The tonal shroud deepens, enveloping all in a ritual of resignation. No catharsis awaits, no epiphany to pierce the gloom, only the steady accumulation of insight that weighs heavier with each turn. The wanderer rises, compelled by an inscrutable impulse, continuing the traversal of barren plains, where mirages of oases taunt with false promises. Emotional gravity pulls downward, the heart a leaden core, pulsating with the rhythm of inevitable decay. Themes interweave, evolving from the isolation of the individual to the absurdity of cosmic scale, where stars burn indifferently, their light reaching eyes long after extinction, a posthumous mockery. Dread permeates every pore, a psychological vice that tightens with contemplation, squeezing out illusions until only the bare skeleton of truth remains. Existence as perpetual ordeal, without origin, purpose, or terminus. In this expanse, the wanderer encounters echoes of others, faint silhouettes on the horizon, each mirroring the same bowed posture, the same halting gait. Yet proximity brings no solace. Instead, it amplifies the alienation, highlighting the unbridgeable gulfs between souls. Conversations, if they occur, dissolve into monosyllabic murmurs, affirmations of shared futility that offer no balm. The mind spirals outward now, encompassing the philosophical quandary of meaning-making in a meaningless void. Efforts to impose order through art, science, devotion, reveal themselves as Sisyphean labors, boulders rolled uphill only to tumble back, crushing the spirit anew. The horror intensifies in this recognition, a dense fog that obscures vision, leaving the wanderer to navigate by instinct alone, each step a gamble against encroaching madness. Pressure mounts, existential in its scope, psychological in its intimacy. The body, once a vessel, becomes a prison, sensations amplified into torments. The itch of skin against fabric, the throb of pulse in temples, the gnaw of hunger that signifies nothing beyond survival's cruel imperative. Ideas evolve, spiraling into contemplations of oblivion's allure, the seductive whisper of non-being as the only escape for being's tyranny. Yet even this is denied, for the act of cessation requires will, and will is eroded by the relentless grind. The atmosphere congeals, a palpable entity, sermonizing on the inevitability of erosion, how all forms yield to entropy, structures collapsing into uniformity, distinctions blurred until only homogeneity remains, a gray expanse mirroring the internal desolation. Deeper descent beckons, the wanderer delving into the abyss of self-doubt, questioning the validity of perception itself. Are these planes real, or figments of a fractured psyche? The distinction blurs, philosophical inquiry merging with psychological unraveling, creating a vortex that draws all inward. Dread evolves, no longer a mere emotion, but a state of being, infusing every thought with its tint. The tonal oppression solidifies, a calm recitation of doom, ritualistic in its repetition without redundancy, each idea building upon the last, expanding the architecture of despair. Emotional weight accrues, layer upon layer, until the wanderer staggers under its mass, the soul compressed into a singularity of anguish. The narrative of existence unfolds without climax, a slow unraveling where themes interlock in ever-complex patterns. The futility of resistance against the inexorable, the horror of awareness in an uncaring universe. the pressure of isolation amid apparent multiplicity. The wanderer persists, not from hope, but from inertia, the momentum of being propelling forward into further obscurity. Philosophical depths plumbed reveal no bedrock, only deeper voids, each revelation a heavier chain. Psychological strains manifest as hallucinations, whispers from the gray, intoning litanies of loss, reminders that attachment breeds only greater suffering. The spiral widens, encompassing the terror of repetition, cycles within cycles, where patterns emerge only to dissolve, leaving the mind adrift in patternless chaos. In this unending traversal, the wanderer confronts the ultimate indifference, the cosmos as a blind mechanism, grinding souls into anonymity. No resolutions emerge. Ideas evolve into more profound questions, each unanswered query a spike in the crown of thorns. The atmosphere remains unrelieved, a dense pall that smothers initiative, leaving only the ritual of motion, the sermon of silence. Dread permeates, existential in breadth, psychological in depth, emotional in intensity. The figure moves onward, the horizon receding eternally, the weight unlifted, the abyss unclosed, the descent perpetual. The expanse stretches without boundary, a monochrome plane where distance collapses into sameness and every direction folds back upon itself. The wanderer does not walk so much as is carried forward by the inertia of continuing, legs moving through habit long after intention has evaporated. Each footfall produces no echo, absorbed instantly by the absorbent silence that coats everything like fine ash. This is not emptiness in the poetic sense. It is saturation with absence, a fullness of nothing that presses against the skin from every angle until breathing feels like an intrusion. Awareness itself has become the primary wound. To be conscious here is to carry an open incision that never clots, through which leaks the slow realization that nothing requires one's presence. The universe did not ask to be witnessed, yet witnessing occurs anyway, an involuntary trespass. The wanderer stops, not from fatigue, but from the sudden clarity that stopping changes nothing. Motion and stillness are equally irrelevant gestures performed before an audience that never arrived. The sky remains featureless, neither lightening nor darkening, locked in a perpetual half-dusk that denies both dawn and night. Time does not pass. It accumulates, piling up in invisible drifts until the mind suffocates beneath its own chronology. Beneath the feet the ground has grown softer, almost gelatinous, as though the substance of the world is slowly losing the will to hold shape. Each step sinks a fraction deeper than the last, not enough to trap, only enough to remind that solidity is provisional. The body registers this betrayal as a dull nausea, the visceral knowledge that even the illusion of support is withdrawing. Philosophical vertigo sets in, not the romantic dizziness of gazing into abysses, but the mundane horror of realizing the floor was never there, and one has simply grown accustomed to falling very slowly. Thoughts no longer arrive as discrete entities. They seep, merge, overlap until the distinction between thinker and thought dissolves. What remains is a diffuse field of dread, impersonal yet intimate, like humidity that has learned your name. The mind attempts to name its condition, meaninglessness, alienation, contingency, and each label only adds another layer of insulation between the self and the raw sensation it tries to describe. The labels are bandages applied to a body that no longer bleeds because it has already emptied itself. Farther out, the landscape begins to repeat in subtle variations that are never quite identical, yet never meaningfully different. A low ridge appears, then another, identical in height and curvature, yet each one feels like a fresh insult. The repetition is not mechanical. It is malicious in its indifference, as though the world is saying, "Look, here is another configuration of the same futility, slightly rearranged so you cannot accuse me of laziness." The wanderer understands that if it walked forever, it would never encounter novelty. only new arrangements of the identical exhaustion. The psychological pressure has evolved into something architectural. It no longer crushes from above. It has built walls inward, constructing narrower and narrower corridors within the skull until thinking can only proceed single file. Every idea must pass through the same gauntlet of prior realizations, each one stripping away another layer of possible consolation. Hope was evicted long ago. Then went anger, grief, curiosity. What remains is a quiet administrative horror, the calm recognition that one is sentenced to experience every remaining second of sentience without parole or remission. Occasionally fragments of what might once have been memories surface, not as pictures, but as textures, the specific weight of someone else's hand once placed on a shoulder, the temperature of water against skin in a place that no longer exists, the sound pitch of a voice saying a name that belonged to someone else. These sensations do not comfort. They function as evidence for the prosecution. They prove that attachment was once possible. Therefore, its permanent impossibility is a deliberate amputation rather than an original condition. The mind is forced to live inside the difference between what was briefly permitted and what has since been forever prohibited. The sermon continues without speaker or listener. It is delivered by the air itself, by the way light falls without warmth, by the manner in which silence manages to be both absolute and somehow accusatory. You are here because you're not elsewhere, it intones. You continue because cessation would require agency, and agency has been revealed as decorative. The only freedom left is the freedom to notice how little freedom remains, and even that observation is compulsory. Night never fully arrives, yet the quality of gray deepens imperceptibly until it acquires density, pressing against the eyes like wet cloth. The wanderer sits, again, not from choice, but because the distinction between sitting and standing has lost urgency. In this posture, the body becomes an object among objects, no more entitled to verticality than the stones or the dust. The distinction between inside and outside erodes further. Skin feels less like a boundary and more like a zone of negotiation where the atmosphere slowly infiltrates the bloodstream. What remains is the slow recognition that dread is not an emotion, but the substrate beneath emotion, the condition from which all feeling arises and to which all feeling returns. Joy was never absent. It was simply a temporary modulation of the baseline horror, a brief harmonic in an otherwise monotonous dirge. Love, rage, wonder the same. Temporary discolorations in an otherwise uniform field of ontological nausea. The wanderer does not pray for release, because prayer would imply the existence of an addressee capable of granting or withholding. There's only the address, hanging in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. The cosmos does not ignore. It simply lacks the category ignore. To be ignored, one must first be noticed. Hours or centuries pass in this attitude. Time has become ornamental. Eventually, the body rises again, not because it hopes for destination, but because inertia has not yet fully claimed the musculature. Forward motion resumes, each step a small bureaucratic insistence that existence should continue filing its paperwork. Somewhere ahead, perhaps no farther than the next breath, the gray will deepen into black without ever becoming night. The wanderer will enter that transition without ceremony, without final statement, without even the dignity of noticing the precise moment when observation ceases. Until then, the sermon continues calm, unhurried, delivered in the language of gravity and duration. There is no why worth answering. There is only the fact of having to continue until you don't. And even that, until, is mercifully vague. The plane receives another footprint, then another, each one slightly deeper than the last, each one slightly less convinced of its own necessity, yet still placed, still advancing, still sinking, slowly, ceremonially, irredeemably, into the same gray that has already forgotten every previous impression. The wanderer advances into a region where the gray begins to exhibit faint striations, not colors exactly, but variations in opacity, like layers of gauze stacked infinitely deep. These are not invitations to interpretation. They are merely the world's way of demonstrating that even uniformity can fracture without producing difference. The eye strains against them, seeking pattern where none exists, and in that straining lies another layer of torment. The mind's compulsion to impose order on the unordered, a biological betrayal that ensures perpetual disappointment. Footsteps now produce a subtle resistance, as if the ground has developed a memory of its own, recalling each previous depression and subtly altering the next. This is not progress. It is accretion, the slow buildup of evidence that repetition is the only constant, each iteration wearing deeper grooves into the psyche without ever reaching a core. Consciousness, once a flickering light, has dimmed to embers, illuminating only enough to reveal the extent of the surrounding dark. The horror resides in this partial vision. Full blindness might offer oblivion, but this half-sight insists on teasing with outlines of what might be, only to dissolve them upon closer inspection. The wanderer contemplates the architecture of suffering, how it constructs itself from the materials at hand. Loneliness as foundation, futility as walls, indifference as roof, creating a dwelling that is both inescapable and self-reinforcing. Philosophical inquiry spirals here, questioning not just the why of existence, but the how of its persistence, the mechanisms by which being perpetuates itself despite every incentive to cease. The body serves as unwilling accomplice, its rhythms, heartbeat, respiration, the grind of joints, forming a metronome that ticks out the seconds of unwanted duration. Pressure manifests now as an internal tide, rising and receding without pattern, flooding the mind with waves of unnameable unease. It begins in the chest, a constriction that mimics drowning on dry land, then spreads outward, numbing extremities while sharpening awareness in the center. Psychological fissures widen, admitting doubts that were once peripheral but now occupy the core. The suspicion that all prior experiences were mere preludes to this state, that life was always tending toward this gray convergence where distinctions collapse. Ideas evolve in tightening coils, from the personal erosion of identity to the broader dissolution of meaning, where language itself fails, words becoming hollow vessels that float aimlessly across the mental surface without anchoring to anything substantial. The sermon of the expanse intones without voice, a vibration felt in the bones. Behold the economy of despair, where every expenditure of thought returns diminished, interest compounded in the negative. The wanderer encounters no mirrors, yet reflection occurs involuntarily, the self turned inward upon itself, examining its own mechanisms like a machine disassembling its parts mid-operation. What emerges is the recognition that autonomy is illusory, actions mere reactions to stimuli long forgotten, chains of cause extending backward into infinity without a prime mover. Existential weight accrues, not suddenly, but through imperceptible additions, each insight a pebble added to the load, until mobility becomes theoretical. Deeper in, the air acquires a tactile quality, brushing against exposed skin like unseen filaments, each contact a reminder of vulnerability. The body, once reliable, now registers phantom sensations, itches that migrate, aches that bloom without cause, symptoms of the mind's overflow, psychological turmoil manifesting somatically. The horror densifies here, becoming less abstract and more embodied, the dread of being trapped not just in space but in flesh, this temporary envelope that decays even as it endures. Philosophical threads interlace, weaving patterns of contingency. Existence as accident, consciousness as byproduct, suffering as inevitable residue of both. The spiral descends, encompassing the terror of scale, from the infinitesimal neural firings that constitute thought to the vast cosmic indifference that renders them irrelevant. No companions appear, yet the absence feels populated, as if the void is crowded with potential presences that never materialize. This is the cruelty of solitude. not mere aloneness, but the perpetual almost connection, the sense that others exist just beyond perception, their echoes fading before they can resolve into clarity. Emotional residue clings, remnants of what might have been bonds, now calcified into barriers that isolate further. The wanderer pauses again, not to rest, but to absorb the latest revelation. That pause itself is futile, a temporary halt in an unstoppable flow, like a river freezing only to thaw and resume its course unchanged. The tonal oppression evolves, sermon-like in its relentless cadence, ritualistic in its unfolding without climax. Ideas build upon prior foundations, expanding into contemplations of temporality, how time is not a line but a knot, tangled loops where past and future collapse into an eternal present of unease. Dread permeates as foundational element, psychological in its intimacy, existential in its breadth, a dense medium through which all perception filters. The wanderer resumes motion, compelled by the same inscrutable force that animates stars and atoms, a universal imperative toward continuation without justification. In this progression without progress, the gray begins to pulse faintly, not with light, but with a subtle undulation, as if the expanse breathes in sympathy with the wanderer's labored inhalations. This synchronization horrifies, implying a connection where none should exist, the world mirroring the internal rhythm in mocking harmony. Philosophical depths reveal the absurdity of resistance, how struggle only embeds one deeper in a matrix of being. The mind spirals outward, encompassing collective illusions, societal constructs as shared hallucinations, crumbling under their own weight, yet perpetually rebuilt from the debris. Emotional gravity intensifies, pulling toward a center that is empty, a void masquerading as substance. The narrative persists without arc, a flat trajectory through undulating terrain, themes interweaving in ever more intricate patterns, the futility of interpretation in an uninterpretable realm, the pressure of awareness in an unaware cosmos, the horror of endurance without endpoint. The wanderer traverses ridges that rise and fall without drama, each crest revealing only more of the same, each valley a brief intensification of shadow. Ideas evolve, from the erosion of self to the dissolution of all boundaries, where inner and outer merge into undifferentiated gray. Psychological strains compound, manifesting as a persistent hum in the ears, a tinnitus of the soul that drowns out silence without providing sound. The body adapts, or pretends to, continuing its mechanical functions amid growing disconnection. The sermon drones on, calm and inexorable. There is no escape because there is no enclosure. The prison is the expanse itself, boundless and therefore unbreachable. Dread solidifies, no longer fluid but crystalline, refracting every thought into facets of anguish. The figure advances, the horizon a perpetual tease, receding with mathematical precision, maintaining distance as a constant. Weight accumulates, existential in scope, psychological in execution, emotional in resonance. The descent continues, unresolved, the abyss expanding inward and outward simultaneously, a spiral without center or circumference, heavy with the unspoken promise of more to come. The gray has thickened into something almost architectural, walls of mist rising without seams, enclosing the wanderer in a chamber whose dimensions refuse measurement. No horizon remains to chase. The line where earth meets sky has dissolved, leaving only verticality without up or down, a suspension that mimics falling while standing perfectly still. The body registers this as pressure distributed evenly across every surface, skin, lungs, corneas, until the distinction between inside and outside becomes academic. Breathing is no longer an act, but a passive exchange, the atmosphere inhaling and exhaling through the organism with indifferent courtesy. Thoughts have slowed to the consistency of tar. Each one emerges only after laborious gestation, lingers long enough to be recognized as another variant of the same insight, then sinks again without residue. What once felt like spiraling descent now registers as stasis masquerading as motion, the mind turning in place, wearing the same groove deeper until the rotation becomes indistinguishable from immobility. The sermon, if it ever had a voice, has fallen silent, not ceased, but transmuted into the background radiation of being itself. Its message requires no articulation because it is written in the very resistance of matter to cessation. Here, at the terminal narrowing, dread sheds its psychological costume and stands revealed as physics, the inexorable attraction of entropy toward equilibrium, the slow cooling of all gradients until temperature, thought, distinction, all flatten into uniform zero. The wanderer understands, without triumph or despair, that resistance was never an option, but an illusion generated by the temporary steepness of those gradients. Every scream, every prayer, every small act of defiance was merely heat dissipating along the only permitted vector toward dissipation. No final gesture suggests itself. Raising arms to heaven would be theatrical. Collapsing would be redundant. The body remains upright, because uprightness has not yet been countermanded by greater force. Eyes stay open because closing them would imply decision, and decision has long since evaporated. What persists is observation without observer, witnessing without witness, a pure registering of the gradual erasure of registering. In this last chamber, the air has acquired weight without density, pressing inward with the gentleness of snowfall that accumulates until structures collapse under beauty too patient to be noticed as violence. The wanderer feels vertebrae settling millimeter by millimeter, as though the spine itself is learning surrender vertebra by vertebra. Blood moves more slowly through narrowing vessels. Synapses fire with increasing reluctance, each impulse carrying less information than the last. The universe, having never particularly noticed this single point of consciousness, now withdraws its attention with the same indifference it extended. No light fades because no light was ever promised. No darkness rushes in because darkness would require contrast, and contrast has become unaffordable luxury. What arrives instead is the subtraction of qualities one by one. First color, already gone, then shape, dissolving, then texture, slipping, then temperature, neutralizing, then duration, stretching toward irrelevance. The final subtraction is the subtraction of subtraction, the moment when even the concept of loss loses its meaning because nothing remains capable of registering absence. The wanderer does not vanish dramatically. Vanishing would require an audience and a before/after. Instead, there occurs a gradual indistinction, edges softening until perimeter and interior agree they were never separate. The gray does not swallow. It simply stops distinguishing between itself and what it once contained. Footprints, if they were ever deep enough to matter, fill themselves without wind or water, the ground remembering nothing because memory would be a form of preservation. In the place where narration once stood, nothing stands. Not silence, for silence implies the possibility of sound. Not void, for void implies the possibility of filling. Only the continuation of what requires no continuation, the persistence of what has forgotten why persistence was ever necessary. And then, without interval or punctuation, even the grammar of continuation falters. The expanse remains, unobserved, unconcerned, unending in the only way that requires no end, by having never truly begun.